Hi, welcome back to my channel. I guess you're doing good. Today I'm going to talk about Kubernetes part 4, which is of Ingress related kind. What is Ingress? Ingress is basically is a front-end web server which will be hosting for the backend so that any request is coming from the web, it first connects to the Ingress, that is the front-end web server. From the front-end web server, the request will be redirected to the backend service. The backend service which will go ahead and talk to the real pod and gets the content and then responds back to the client. The clients could be either browser clients or CURL based clients, any clients, but always the request will be channeled through the front controller as a web service. Okay, so let us try to understand what is the front end web service. So here I'm going to talk about a real-time exercise, that is Kubernetes real-time exercise. So I'm going to host a deployment based service, and I'm also going to host a service type to access the deployment of NodePort is the kind, and the Ingress. Ingress is basically the front end web server which will receive the request. Based on the request, it will start dispatching to the respective backend service. Say I have application. My application has say 3 services. Example: order management service, inventory management service, and payment service. So now I wanted to handle all these 3 services based on my the prefix based, say www.abc.com/order. That means it redirects to the order service. Say www.abc.com/payment. If I specify, it has to route to payment service, like so forth. So I should have a fine-grained control from the front end side. I can host as many as backend services which is my application needs, so that manageability, maintainability of front end services, back end services are easier to handle it. That's the reason this Ingress is arrived. So Ingress is an object. This object basically receives the request from external service, say client, one service, either browser, maybe one type of client, say CURL, maybe other type of the client. So they send their request to this Ingress. Ingress will look for that path and then redirect the request to the respective backend services. Okay, so Ingress controller must be up and running in the Kubernetes engine to do the Ingress type of testing by implementing within our application. Without running the Ingress controller, we cannot do it. So ensure that Ingress controller is up and running. Then I'm going to host my pod service and my pods as a deployment. So for example, in this exercise, let us try to set up a HTTP prefix based. The prefix which is request which is coming with SVC1, SVC2. It could come on like this in this particular exercise. So I'm going to redirect respect to the service. And NodePort, basically, which we have seen in part 3. Still, I'm going to explain here. Kubernetes will allocate a specific port on each node to that service, and any request to your cluster on that port gets forwarded to the its backend service, whichever is running. Okay, that's how it is mapping. Let us try to see how the request navigates from the web browser or CURL. Say it is a web client. If it is trying to hit a browser on the Ingress port, so Ingress will be up and running. Say this is running on 8080 port. Say here I'm exposing a Kubernetes service which is of 8080, the backend service. Say this pod is running actually the Spring Boot application. as 8080. So whichever is the service Kubernetes kind, either NodePort, load balancer, whatever which we are defining, based on that, it will handle appropriately. Say here, I'm specifying as a NodePort. NodePort of type 8080, which will automatically forward the request to the pods and gets the response back to the client. Say this is order service. Let us say this is an inventory service. Say here I'm going to host another service. For example, say payment service. Say here bill service and so forth. So based on the prefix, I wanted to forward all of my requests to respective backends. So that can be easily achieved through Ingress. So this is how does look like the Ingress configuration file. So we need to know what is the API version. So this is a networking based networking Kubernetes. This is the standard you have to use certain data, and here you can give any name. And the Ingress which I am going to implement using Nginx. This is one of the web server which is allowing to do this kind of a request routing. So here I am specifying rewrite target to context backslash. Here I am specifying the set of rules. Specification, I am specifying the rules. Any request is coming HTTP path as a prefix slash svc1, then forward to backend service this, and the port is this. So this is the backend service is up and running. Like this, svc2 is a prefix and forward to its backend service. So here I'm giving you the integration architecture. So as I said before in part 2 and 3, I have a Windows operating system, I have a Linux operating system, I have inside the Linux operating system running a Minikube. Inside the Minikube, I'm running pods, services, and Ingress, all those things. Okay. So to access from my Windows machine, my Ingress port, that is 8080, I'm setting up a port forwarding rule so that I can able to access my Ingress to backend. It automatically forwards the request based on the needs. So these are the prerequisites: Docker, public registry, and Kubernetes, and internet connectivity. The intended are developers who already. These are the reference URLs. So we understood what is meant by Ingress and how request has been routing according to the diagram from the PowerPoint. Now let's try to do the hand. So as we were talking, deployment, service of type NodePort, and Ingress. So Ingress controller must be up and running in the Kubernetes engine. So let's try to host my Spring Boot Docker image into the Kubernetes. So what I will do is Kubernetes, I have a namespace ns-realtime. So I'll see is there any resources running in my namespace. There is no resource available. I'm going to host a deployment. Create deployment. I specify image which is going to pull from the Docker's Hub public repository sample docker :1.0. This is a Spring Boot based application which I have created image. Okay, so the name of that is missing. I say Spring Web, the name of the deployment. Okay, real time, this namespace also type mistake. I'm fixing it. So my deployment is created. Let's try to see whether my deployment successfully created or not. Get pods deploy. That means there is a pod created with Spring Web, and there is a deployment also created for that means my deployment is successful. Now let me try to expose type, as I said, NodePort, I'm specifying, and port I'm specifying equal to 8080. My pod is running 8080. Now I am going to expose my deployment. So that is the service which I am creating as per the diagram, the service. Into this namespace, type NodePort and the service name also deployment, Spring Web. Okay. Now let's see whether this is created. Okay, good. Now let me see, yes, service. So now we can see that my service created, that is exposing on 8080 is the port, and my deployment ready, my pod is ready. So this is service 1, for example. Let me try to do it doing the same thing for another service. So deployment is not found. So let's go ahead and create one of the service, that is Spring Web 2. I'm creating Spring Web 2 service created now. Now let me try to issue. Now I have created another deployment, that is creating another pod that is ready. Now I need to expose the service, right? So I use expose Spring Web 2. I'm specifying. Now I have exposed two services according to the theory, order service and payment service, for example. But here both I am considering for the same Docker image which I am using for the Kubernetes deployment. So now I can see that Spring Web is one service, Spring Web 2 is another service. Now I suppose to have the two service context as I have described, s/svc1 which is going to connect to this, svc2 which is going to connect to this. How can I do it? So now my services are up and running, the backend services. Now I can do Spring Web, I say Ingress. So in the Ingress, I'm specifying that. So this is the Ingress syntax you need to follow, which I have depicted over there. And this is annotation. So any request is coming with this, I'm redirecting with /. So this is the prefix one for the backend service, Spring Web. svc2 prefix for backend service, Spring Web 2. That is also running on this. So I'm going to host it now in my namespace. So I create this resource -f Spring Web. Now let me go ahead and verify Ingress. Now I can see that my Ingress service is also ready. Okay. So which is running on port 8080. What is the IP address of that? This is the IP address of that which is running. That means according to this diagram, if you see it, Ingress is running on 80, service running on 8080, pod is running on 8080. So any request will be receiving here. So any request will be receiving here. That means my pod is ready. So now what I'm going to do, my applications are up and running or not, I need to test it. So I can test it from here, but if I want to access this port outside, I supposed to do a port forwarding. So that port forwarding which I have done, Kubernetes port forward -nginx is the namespace where the nginx control is running. This is the service in that namespace available. I'm port forwarding on 8000 port. Now what I can do is I can go to the browser. Before I go to the browser, I wanted to show you something. So now Kubernetes is all good. So what we can do is we can see that logs, whether Tomcat is successfully started or not. Now we can see that this engine is started up and running. Now we have not seen any string of the request. Now I'm going to specify localhost 8000 prefix is svc1. So this means my request has been fulfilled based on the ingress. So let me go ahead and issue this. Now you can see that this log has been updated. Okay, initializing the dispatcher servlet. That means request received and processed by my pod, and you can see the response on the browser. Now the same way I wanted to demonstrate that the other pod, whether that log started successfully of my backend service. Yes, I can see that this is also successfully started. Now what I want to tell you is I wanted to use my browser client, use the same ingress port of the port forwarding, and then hit it. Now still I see that this is home page because I have hosted both the same. That's the reason you see both the same. Now let me see whether this request is processed by this. Yes, it is processed. So this way you can simplify as many as backend services. If you are keep adding, you can handle it through a simple ingress controller. So that's how you can test all of your applications with respect to dev, stage, production. You have separate namespaces for each environment and host it, test it, your backend services. I hope this helps you to grow better in terms of the technology learning. That's the end of this demo. Like it, share it, subscribe it. If you have any questions, please post it. I'll try to respond it to you. Until then, see you. I come up with new videos.